Okay, so let's pick back up with that Magna Carta. So, it was signed by King John in 1215 under pressure from nobles. It required him to observe or follow certain rites for those mostly nobles, things like a jury trial before they could be sentenced to prison. English Parliament is formed in 1265. It increased the rights of the nobility, but again, not the general population. They set up the House of Lords, which is like representative nobles and church hierarchy. They have a House of Commons, which were elected representatives of wealthy townspeople. So we start to see limits on the king's power, particularly first here in England. This is just kind of showing you the carving up of England, Scotland, and Irish Kingdom. So Norman England included all of here and here down on that Normandy part of France. Here's our Magna Carta, definitely a very important document. It's considered to be one of the most important documents that leads us into democratic type of governments in the future. Okay, Crusades. Yay! European Christians wanted to reclaim the Holy Land, which is this region of Palestine in the Middle East that contains sites of spiritual significance to people like Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And spoiler alert, they all want it, and they don't want each other to have it. So the Christians used to have access to this land until it came under control of the Seljuk Turks, who were Muslims, in 1071. So this leads to a lot of problems, especially due to the fact that in Europe during this time, usually the eldest brother in a family inherited like the entire estate. So if you were a family of, multiple boys, only the eldest one is going to get the money, the land, the estate, etc. Which means that if you are a younger son, you have like little to no access to wealth or land, even if you were born into a wealthy family, and basically they're left to like twiddle their thumbs with nothing to do. So these landed nobles thought that, hey, why don't we come up with something for them to do? I have an idea. How about they go on a military campaign? Then they won't be so restless and like unemployed. Yay. So, yeah, merchants really wanted access to trade routes through the Middle East as well. So, like, there's a lot of reasons that lead into this. But the Christian Crusades are a series of campaigns that last from about 1095 when they first begin into the 1200s. First Crusade, of the four, this is the only like clear victory for the Christians. It goes kind of downhill for them after that. They conquered Jerusalem in 1099. However, Muslim forces under Saladin regained control in 1187, so they didn't hold on to it for all that long. Okay. Based on this map, yeah, this is the question I like to pose. Which one was maybe not the smartest or the dumbest? Take a look at those campaigns, see what you can come up with, and maybe why, based on like where they're going in the time period. I will also include a link into the Schoology folder to watch the crash course video on the Crusades. It's a pretty good one. Okay, overall effects of the Crusades. Knowledge of the world beyond Western Europe increased as the Crusaders encountered both Byzantine and Islamic cultures. That increased the demand in Europe for new items that they wanted from the East. So that's going to lead to an increase in trade. Exposure to new ideas from Byzantium and Muslim worlds are going to contribute to the Renaissance, the rise of secularism. However, we get some negative stuff like the plague, also known as the Black Death, that is introduced to Europe by way of trading routes. It is a major epidemic that lasts from 1347 to 1351, plus additional outbreaks throughout the years. Historians estimate that as many as 25 million Europeans died. This led to a lot of reduced economic activity. Okay, local economic self sufficiency in Europe eventually gives way to an interest in goods from other European areas and beyond. Like I mentioned before, crusades definitely help pave the way for that. Lords and armies are bringing back like these beautiful new fabrics and spices and things like that from the east, and then people want it. So the Silk Road trade routes remained in operation, as did sea routes across the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean. Global trade is going to increase. In the late 13th century, we get this guy named Marco Polo, who is an Italian from Venice, and he visits the court of the Mongols, Kublai Khan, and he describes these customs that he saw, and it just the writing intrigues Europeans. They're mesmerized by it. So their curiosity of Asia skyrockets, stimulating more interest in more trade, things like cartography, so map making, like wondering what's out there beyond the world. He traveled all over the world, very famous kind of explorer, traveler, and writer. Okay, the Hanseatic League. So, in the late 13th century, cities in northern Germany and in Scandinavia forced a commercial alliance called the Hanseatic League. Controlled trade in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. They were able to monopolize trade in goods such as timber, grain, leather, salted fish, etc. Ships would round the Atlantic coast of Western Europe and go to ports in the Mediterranean, picking up valuable goods from Arab caravans. This lasts until about the mid 17th century. You can pause here and check out some medieval trade routes. Okay, guilds are just these associations of craftspeople or merchants organized in towns. Each occupation usually had its own guild. Think of them as almost like the precursor to like a union. They regulated rules for apprenticeship, helped families of injured or killed workers. They had a little bit of quality control, a little bit of economic influence. They could apply pressure to a local lord or monarch. So these would be just kind of some of the people like working within those craft guilds. So you got like the master that usually like owns the shop and is the master of whatever he does. You've got an apprentice working for him, journeymen, etc. Some changes in agriculture. So there's a population growth after the 10th century that resulted from decreases in Viking raids and improvement in agricultural methods. Surpluses encouraged the growth of towns and markets. Urban growth starts to hamper a little bit after about 1300-ish in a 5th-century cooling of the climate that is often called the Little Ice Age. So the climate decreased by about 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit, which seems like not a big deal, but can have big lasting impacts. So those lower temperatures reduce the agricultural productivity by a lot, which then means less trade, and then cities are going to grow a little bit slower. Urban life. If you lived in a city, it was dirty and gross and unsanitary, and there was raw sewage in the streets, and there were rats and fleas, and fire was basically always a threat because everything was built with wood and they were overcrowded. And those defensive walls that people would build to keep invaders out also meant that you couldn't expand the city. So you were confined into this small, tiny little space. We start to see new Gothic-style cathedrals replacing that old Romanesque style, as you can see in that picture behind. Those like tall spikes, right, are very reminiscent, right, of that Gothic architectural style. Lots of stained glass windows during this time. So we still see some of those around today. This one is probably one of the most famous. If you don't know it, stop, Google, look it up. Hint, it's in Paris. Okay, let's wrap up with gender roles really quickly. So, lots of patriarchal thinking continues. Men think that women don't need to be educated, even though women like usually manage those big manor accounts and things, and proved over and over that they were smart enough to do things, but apparently they weren't valued enough to be given a full education. Women in religious orders, however, had more opportunities to demonstrate their administrative skills than other women during this time. Some women are allowed to be guild members and artisans, although most did not have property rights. Women in Islamic societies tended to enjoy higher levels of equality, particularly in areas like Africa and Southeast Asia. And that's all I've got for you today.